So I have another crop of 10 philosophy-related questions, and I'm going to answer each of these and try to do it under 2 minutes in another 10 shorts sequence. A lot of these are dealing with topics in political theory or in epistemology, and then there's a few that are focused on specific philosophical thinkers or movements. So, end authority, and perhaps that name is a little bit revealing, says, what are your opinions on property rights, specifically John Locke's ideas of property rights? And as the question goes on, it's clear that that user does not think very highly of them. So two questions really rolled into one there, and I'm going to focus more on Locke. Do I think that property is in all cases a sort of absolute right? Once a person has property, that they have an absolute right to it, that only they can alienate. I don't think so. And as a matter of fact, Locke even seems to suggest that if somebody is being totally irrational in their use of property, that they don't have a complete right to it as well. Do I think that Locke's labor theory of property, that is, by mixing one's labor, which one owns, according to Locke, in with raw materials or with materials that one is getting from somebody else, that it makes it one's own, that it gives a person a right to have that as their own property and not to be interfered with by other people. I actually find that kind of reasonable. It's not something that can be elevated into an absolute principle and the single basis for understanding of property, but it does make sense to say that the people who, if we had, for example, uncultivated land, and the people who actually invest the time and labor into it ought to have a right to that, and that right ought to be respected by others. That makes some sense. It gets into a lot of tricky questions, like if I start chasing the deer, but I'm not the person who kills it, do I get to have it? And once we start talking about a market economy that's based around specialization of labor and exchange, it gets rather tricky, and his theory starts to break down. But I think that it has some merits to it. This is the first of 3 questions asked to me by Melanie Grace Zippigan, who is in a class where her professor has introduced her to a number of different theories and theorists and wants her to answer these very questions, and she wants to think about how they'd be answered, according to Plato or Aquinas or stuff like that. I'm not going to answer them that way because I'm not going to do her homework for her. But I will answer these questions, which are very interesting, like, should people overthrow the government? And about that, I'll say 2 main things. One is that many philosophers would say that there are conditions under which it would be right for people to overthrow the government that they're being ruled by. And there's a lot of different factors that would go into it. The arbitrariness of the government, whether the government is actually effectively, promoting the goods of the people that are being governed. What the possible replacement would be. All these are things that would have to be taken into consideration. But I'm very attracted to thinkers who will think of this in terms of the common good. Is the government actually governing for the good of those who are under its charge, or is it doing it for the benefit of, say, its constituents against the other party's constituents? By this actual criteria, neither political party that we have when they have their own regimes would actually be governing for the benefit of the common good, and that's a really important thing to consider. Another thing is, even if it is legitimate to overthrow the government in a modern liberal democracy where logistics, transportation, all the economy, they're all closely interconnected, would the sort of chaos that results from actually overthrowing a government violently, because we're talking about violent, revolution in this case, would that really justify the benefits that are going to come about? That's a vexed question, not one that you can answer in the abstract, you have to look at it case by case by case. So another question from Melanie Grace Zippigan, what makes a government legitimate? And again, I would say that it has to, in order to justify its own existence, it can't just say, well, we're here and we're in charge. Government actually has to be for the benefit of those who are being governed by it. Now, this could encompass a lot of different things, and quite often there will be a lot of disagreement between the people who are doing the governing and the people who are being governed, just how much benefit is actually being conferred. And oftentimes benefits are hard to see. You know, the existence of social order in the first place ought to be viewed as indeed a benefit, not as just sort of something that you take for granted. But those are you know, the sort of considerations that you want to consider, that you want to take into consideration when you're thinking about the legitimacy of government. I would say that in our time, we've become accustomed to seeing legitimacy as dependent to a certain extent upon the ability for us to participate in governance, right? But that's really illusory. We don't, in modern liberal democracies that we currently live in, except at the local level, we really don't have much opportunity to cast any sort of important vote. You know, I, for example, live in a state where it doesn't matter really who I vote for. The state's going to go blue or Democrat. And so, you know, I could vote Democrat if I want, but my vote doesn't count. I can vote Republican if I want. I can throw it to a third party if I want. That doesn't provide legitimacy. So we have to look in other areas for what counts as legitimacy. Another question by Melanie Grace Zippigan, and this is a really important one that starts to get to the heart of things. Who decides what's best for society, the citizens, or the government? My answer, both. And neither. Because it's posing this as if somehow the citizens and the government are like two different classes that, you know, one of them might have the answer and the other one doesn't. Really, figuring out what's best for society is always, it's something that's always in process. We have some guideposts, we have some fixed points, but there's other things that are going to come up that we're not quite sure about how to deal with. You know, great example of that in our own time is we're still kind of trying to figure out what to do with this thing that we call the internet, and who should own things, and what is really to the benefit of society and what is to its detriment, and who's harmed and who's helped. Those are things that require, to some degree, the government to be involved in, but it's also the citizens. And I would say that, you know, yet more important than individual citizens would be what we call voluntary associations, or what de Tocqueville called intermediate institutions. You know, and these would include things like think tanks, or clubs, or associations of professionals. You know, all these sorts of places where ideas get hashed out. Those are where a lot of the discourses about what's best for society get debated. So, you know, there's a tendency for the citizens always to think my interest is the interest of society. And there's a tendency for those in charge in the government to identify whatever will keep them in power or make it easier for them as what's good for society. And we want to have other voices and perspectives represented as well. Gerald Sword asks, what is the first out of a batch of questions? Where do you stand with regards to epistemology? What is your conception of truth? So I'm going to roll those two into one. I don't think he necessarily knows that for me those are very closely connected, but it turns out they are. For me, epistemology, I look at it in a more classic sense. You know, before there was epistemology, there were inquiries into knowledge, and those were always connected with truth. And, you know, the modes of knowledge and the types of truth that we're dealing with. And I would say that when it comes down to it, my conception is, you know, less like Thomas Aquinas's, where truth is something that exists in the intellect, and, you know, if it exists outside of the intellect, it's because it exists in God's intellect. I don't see truth as merely a matter of you know, intellectual adequation to the things. I see truth in a sense that you see in other authors, including, you know, particularly St. Anselm, where truth is something of action and of being as well. So I don't actually do epistemology. I do what I would call metaphysics of knowledge, and think in terms of how those things actually intersect with action, with volition, with choice, which makes me very eccentric. And most epistemologists probably wouldn't be interested in my sort of views on things, but I think it's legitimate to speak of truth in terms of the will, in terms of action, in terms of being, in terms of relations, not just in terms of words, things, and thoughts. So here's a follow-up that Gerald Sword has. In light of the neo-pragmatic approach to truth championed by the likes of Rorty and Davidson, is the approach to philosophy that it is about the truth misguided? Should philosophy serve a function more like keeping us honest? So two things that are going to sound kind of flip right off the bat. One is, who cares what Rorty and Davidson think? I mean, whoever made them into the oracles about where we ought to be going. Maybe they're actually misguided. Maybe the fact that some people have bought into their notions is just a sign of the bankruptcy of those people's understanding of things, as well as that of Rorty and Davidson, and pick whoever else you like. Maybe it's a sign that they were so out of touch with the classic tradition that they couldn't get out of it what they needed and what it makes available. Here's the second flip remark. Should philosophy serve a function more like keeping us honest? I usually don't find that people who are neo-pragmatists are all that honest. And I find that their conception of honesty tends to be very shallow, very adventitious. And this is just my own personal observations. You know, you don't walk down a dark alley with a deconstructionist, in part because they don't really believe in much of anything. And they're willing to make things, you know, shape and shift and become what they like. And from, you know, a historical perspective, you see that this is not really all that new, this sort of attitude towards things. It has different names at different times, but it comes up over and over again. So, you know, if they want to, you know, lay claim to something like keeping us honest, they need something to actually ground that on. And it doesn't have to be some sort of, you know, ironclad, explains everything theory, but it better be something more than just having a conversation or what works or something along those lines. So here's a question from somebody whose name is just Amez. What are great books that teach you how to philosophize and how to write philosophy? You're probably not going to like my answer, because I'm not going to say a textbook, and I'm not going to say a history of philosophy, and I'm not going to say some sort of secondary source. Instead, what I'm going to say is the great books. If you want to learn how to philosophize, I think that the best way to do that is to actually read philosophy from the sources themselves, ideally, if you can, in the original language. And then after you've actually, you know, for instance, if you've read some Plato, then you can read some other people about Plato, like, you know, Friedrich Cobblestone, he's not going to steer you wrong, or you can read some Plato scholars like, you know, say Stanley Rosen or Gregory Vlastos. But until you've actually read the primary texts, I don't think it's really that great to read digestions of them. You want to actually grapple with the stuff yourself, and it's going to take you some time, and it's hard work, and you got to keep going back to it over and over and over again. But if you want to philosophize well, I think that's what you need to do. Now, that's not to say that you can't read people, who are talking about these great thinkers, who are oftentimes themselves great thinkers. In our own time, Alasdair MacIntyre would be a great example of that. Read MacIntyre, you're going to learn something about Plato and about Hegel and about Nietzsche and about Sartre and about all these other people. But you're also going to learn MacIntyre's own take, which is very interesting in its own right, because he's a first-rate philosopher. So I would say, you want to learn how to write philosophy, you want to learn how to do philosophy, you got to study the people who are really good at it. It helps to study with somebody, I think. So that's the advice I'd give. This is from Zero She Flies, and he has taken a whole set of questions that he asked and condensed them down to something very succinct. And he's probably going to get a little bit mad at me because I'm going to suggest that it's too succinct now. So, in your view, what makes for good philosophy as opposed to stating mere opinion? And I'd say, well, mere opinion is like way over here, and good philosophy is over here, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in between. So, I guess it's very difficult to say. There's no single criteria for what makes for good philosophy. I would say that at the very least, you have to be providing some sort of coherent, not necessarily systematic in the sense that everything has its exact place and always holds its place, but some sort of coherent, developed account that actually probes into things and doesn't remain, within the realm of just everyday opinion, what everybody else says about it, doesn't grab for the first immediate straw and just stick, with that, but moves on and tries to examine things. And then tries to actually provide some sort of, here's the why, here's the explanation for things. Anybody can come up with an opinion and say, here's what I think, and it's great because I think it, and that's what we call mere opinion. I tend to think that we have to look to models when we're thinking about good philosophy, and unfortunately a lot of people have crappy models of what counts as good philosophy and don't encounter a lot of the good classical models of good philosophy, and end up just doing stuff that's not particularly good or interesting as a result. I always ask myself, should I read this or should I reread Plato? And because I know Plato's good philosophy, and I don't know whether this over here necessarily is. So Todoroki asks, there's a famous quote from Heidegger on the Zen scholar D.T. Suzuki that says, if I understand this man correctly, this is what I've been trying to say in all my writings. If this is the case, what do you think Heidegger is trying to say that Suzuki managed to express? I don't know. And frankly, I tend not to pay much attention to those sort of sayings. I don't think that there's one central insight to Heidegger any more than there's one central insight to Plato, than there's one central insight to Aristotle. I think that Heidegger himself was wrong about that sort of thing in his discussions about the history of metaphysics. That in a certain way, he's a reductionist, and he's being that way towards himself, and he's doing himself a disservice because his philosophy is, great in part because it's got a lot, it's got some great stuff here and some great stuff here and some great stuff here, and they don't always map on to each other and reduce to one central thing. I have no idea what particular insight that Heidegger thought he was inchoately, gesturing at, that he found in Suzuki. I don't really see all those big similarities that a lot of people want to point out between Heidegger and Buddhism. Despite the fact that Heidegger talks about nothing, he does not mean nothing in the way that Buddhists mean the void or emptiness or nothingness. And despite, the need to pay attention to things and to take in appearances as they are and to not, chain them to values or things like that, I don't really actually see that as that close to Zen. Maybe I'm in the minority on that, though. So I am ending with a very tough question by Mark Smith, and he's referencing my blog, Heavy Metal Philosopher, where I'm trying to bring together two things that are very important in my life and not doing a really successful job with it. And I haven't written much on it lately because I've been so busy. Here's his question. What do you think are some good songs that present important philosophical concepts? How do they convey these ideas effectively? So, it's one thing to like rattle off a number of songs and say, well, this one exemplifies this or exemplifies this. The how is the really interesting question. And I would say some songs do so with philosophical concepts, and they could be epistemological things or metaphysical things, more often metaphysical, or moral or aesthetic things. And they're doing so by referencing them directly or in a sort of mimetic way, like, for example, Rush's song Free Will, where it's something very similar to what you'd see in Sartre, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice, that sort of notion. Or they could be exemplifying it through a kind of developing the character. Like, think about Hawkwind's Master of the Universe. They might be representing a certain point of view on the world or reality or the way things are. And I think a lot of songs do that sort of thing. And the band itself might have a whole, again, I'll use the word ethos going along with that. Like, think about, the attitudes towards modernity that Black Sabbath exemplified in technology and how things are going sour, or Motorhead's sort of, we're just going to, live as hard as we possibly can, and aggressive hedonism. I'm already running out of time. There's a lot more to say about this, but I'm going to cut it short here.